Japanese is a pitch accent language. If a word has an accent, then that word's accent.
Japanese is what is called a Mora-timed language. What this simply means is that every word Welcome to Introduction to Japanese.
Not straight on most English speakers there are tons of remade Japanese you can download on the web. Maybe the most common.
Finally, a summary. 4 hours.
Learning Japanese doesn't suck because it's hard. It sucks because no one gives you the full background first. I self-studied Japanese to the highest N1 proficiency in 5 years, and some of these concepts I didn't even know until several years into studying. And I was like, really? You're telling me this now? So you're welcome. You get the shortcut that I never got. では、日本語のファンダメンタルズを教えていきたいと思います。The first thing that you must understand is that Japanese is not just English but with different words. I used to think that if I had a sentence I wanted to say, but instead of the English words I took the Japanese equivalent of those words and just plugged them in, then it would be Japanese. Watashi taberu popcorn. Boom! I'm fluent! But this thinking is wrong. And it's wrong for exactly 10 reasons. And we're gonna go over what these 10 reasons are so that by the end, you know exactly how the Japanese language works. So let's start with the absolute basics. There are 3 writing systems in Japanese: Hiragana, Katakana, and Kanji. Hiragana you can think of as being the basic alphabet in Japanese. There are 46 letters, or kana, each representing a unique sound. The first 5 kana are the 5 vowels in Japanese. A, I, U, E, O. Then as you move to the next column, it just adds a consonant to those vowels, like K. Ka, ki, ku, ke, ko. S. Sa, shi, su, se, so. These letters are the only ones that break this pattern. You'll notice that normally they should be C, T, and Tu, but they're actually Shi, Chi, and Tsu. Tsu as in tsunami. So it's sa, shi, su, se, so, and ta, shi, tsu, te, to. The N, H, and M columns are pronounced as you'd expect, except for the U sound kana in the H column, which is often romanized as an F. This is because the Japanese hu is not quite an English H or F like hu or fu, but somewhere in between. Hu. So it's ha, hi, hu, he, ho. You also probably noticed that the Y and W columns are missing some kana. There's ya, yu, yo, and wa and wo, but the others are missing. These pronunciations were either never historically used in spoken Japanese, or they were used, but then their pronunciations merged with other kana, so they became obsolete. The wo is also an interesting one. I learned to pronounce it with a soft W. Wo, wo. But in reality, you're safe to just pronounce it like the lone O vowel. O. Over the years, the W sound in this kana has gotten softer. Now this solo N is the only consonant in Japanese that isn't paired with a vowel, and it's often romanized with an N. But don't be fooled. While these letters sound like an English N, na, ni, nu, ne, no, this one is different. It's more nasally. So this word in Japanese isn't pronounced N, but M. M. Really just shove it up there. M. M. Japanese does have some unique sounds to English, but in general, it's pretty straightforward and just takes a bit of practice. But the Japanese R is the one letter I'd say is a true challenge for English speakers. If you can get this one down, you're pretty much all good. I'll pronounce the column first. Da, di, du, de, do. I was taught that it's like an RL combination. Da. But perhaps a better cue for practicing this letter is to think of an L and D. You want the starting tongue position of L. But you want the tongue hit of D. Da. But just a bit softer. Da. So L tongue position start, then soft D tongue hit. Da. Da. Then try to make it one movement without the long buildup. Da. Da. It'll take some practice, so give it some time. And this gives us our first step towards making the sentence correct. Pronounce N and R properly. Some letters are pronounced differently from English, even if they can be written in English. So these letters aren't pronounced taberu and popcorn, but taberu and popcorn. Finishing off the basic sounds of the kana, you can add what's called tenten or maru to the top right of certain kana to change the consonant. The tenten, or literally dot dot, can be added to the kana in these 4 columns. For example, K becomes G, ka, ki, ku, ke, ko becomes ga, gi, gu, ge, go. S typically becomes Z, like za, zu, ze, zo. And T typically becomes D, da, de, do. But again, these 3 kana are slightly different. The shi and chi become ji, and the tsu becomes zu. So these 2 pairs essentially have the same pronunciations when they have tenten. Again, historically they were unique sounds, but they've merged over time. So it's za, ji, zu, ze, zo, and da, ji, zu, de, do. And the H column just becomes a B with the tenten. Ba, bi, bu, be, bo. Finally, maru, or literally circle, adds to the H column, but instead of making it a B sound, it becomes P. Pa, pi, pu, pe, po. One of the last things you need to know about hiragana is the small y-kana. Small versions of the y-kana, ya, yu, yo, can attach to the E sound kana, other than the E kana itself, to make a contraction. For example, ki and a small ya make kya, not kiya, but kya, 1 syllable. Kya, kyu, kyo, like Kyoto, the city. This works for the tenten and maru consonants as well. For example, gya, gyu, gyo. And of course, the R consonant as well, which can be tricky at first. Dya, dyu, dyo. Like the Street Fighter character, it's often anglicized as Ryu, but it's actually 1 syllable. Dyu.
Perfect.
And finally, the shi and chi paired with the small y kana drop the Y sound and just change the vowel. So instead of something like xia and chia, it's more simply sha and cha. Sha, shu, sho, and cha, chu, cho. Then if you add tenten, it's just a J sound for both. Ja, ju, jo. This will have us complete step 2 of fixing this sentence. Write in hiragana. Watashi taberu popcorn. Now you may be exhausted from going through all the hiragana basics, so let me give you some good news. Japanese kana is almost completely phonetic. This means there are very few cases where a kana is not pronounced as it seems. Compare this to English, where the words through, though, tough, trough all have different pronunciations for the OUGH. Not to mention that vowel sounds change when you add another vowel to them. Like the A in bat, when you add an I to it, becomes bait. Whereas in Japanese, if you take the A kana and add an I to it, you just get both pronunciations side by side. Ai. Ai. This is the case for virtually every vowel combination. A and U become au, I and E become ie, etc. The only exception here with vowels is if after O you put U, or if after E you put I, it just extends the first vowel. So O and U don't become OU, but simply O. Similarly, E and I don't become A, but simply E. So for yoji, which means plans, it's not pronounced yoji, but yoji. And the word for teacher in Japanese isn't pronounced sensei, but sensei. I honestly learned this embarrassingly late into my studies. You're welcome. But while we're talking about long vowels, this brings us to a key pronunciation principle in Japanese versus English that I really wish someone had taught me sooner. And that is, Japanese is a Mora-based language, whereas English is a stress-based language. But what the heck does that mean? Think of 1 Mora as 1 unit of duration, and every full-size kana in Japanese is exactly 1 Mora. In other words, taberu and hashiru both have 3 kana, so they're the exact same 3 Mora length in duration, and each kana individually is the exact same length. Taberu, taberu, hashiru, hashiru. English, on the other hand, is a stress-based language. First, the number of letters in an English word doesn't necessarily tell you its duration. For example, string is 6 letters but quite quick to pronounce. But area is only 4 letters but it's longer to pronounce. And most words in English have a stress on one of the syllables, where we pronounce it longer and louder. Photography and emoji. This is partly why English speakers can sound unnatural at first when we speak Japanese. We tend to add stresses to words when they shouldn't be there. The word emoji is a perfect example, which is actually a Japanese word pronounced emoji. So if you're speaking Japanese, it's not emoji, but emoji, each kana being the same length. Since Japanese is a Mora-based language, this is why it has long vowels. You pronounce every kana for 1 unit of length, including extra vowels. So while yuki means snow, yuki means courage. Yuki is 2 kana, so it has 2 moras of length. Yuki. But yuki has 3 kana, so it has 3 moras of length. Yuki. But the small contraction kana like ya, yu, yo don't count as 1 mora. They just attach the previous kana. That's why kya is the same length as ka. So kyaku and kaku are the same length of pronunciation. You'd think duration when speaking is so subtle that it wouldn't matter, but Japanese people are used to hearing these duration of words. If you try to say someone has a lovely husband, shujin, but you accidentally say they have a lovely prisoner, shujin, they will notice. So be careful. Another key here to sounding natural is that this mora timing also applies to the standalone n. For example, the word for easy, kantan, learners often mispronounce it as kantan, as if it's only 2 mora, just attaching the ends onto the previous kana. Kantan. But since every kana has 1 unit of length, it's actually pronounced ka-n-ta-n, 4 units. Kantan. So you almost need to hold a bit when you pronounce the standalone n in Japanese. And finally, the letter tsu can be made small to indicate 1 unit of pause, indicated in English letters with a double consonant. For example, compare the words come and stamp, kite and kite, or idiot and just did, baka and baka. So, watashi ga yatta baka, I just finished doing it, and watashi ga yatta baka, the idiot I had sex with, mean 2 different things. Be careful. So now we understand the foundation of spoken Japanese, mora timing. This includes pauses and long vowels. So when we see the word for popcorn written like this, we now know we need to pronounce a pause here and a long vowel here. So it's not popcorn, but popcorn. Now you're gonna hate me, but remember, I'm just the messenger, okay? There's actually a second alphabet called Katakana. Now I know you're thinking, a second alphabet? This language is stupid. Well, let me explain because it's not as bad as it sounds. First of all the hiragana and pronunciations you learned, you can just replace the hiragana with katakana and that's it. Yada. The pronunciations are the exact same from the darirurero to the Tenten, Maru, and small tsu. So then you're probably thinking, why the frickin' heck do they have a second alphabet then? To which I'd say that's fair, but English has a redundant second alphabet too. Do you know what that is? Capital letters. Capital letters represent the exact same sounds as lowercase letters. We don't need to capitalize the first letter of our sentences or people's names, but we do so to add clarity. We can also use capital letters to express certain emotions, like shouting, "Oh my god," or a wavy feeling, "No!" Katakana is basically like the capital letters in Japanese, except instead of capitalizing sentences or shouting, it's used for foreign words or onomatopoeia words. For example, Tom Cruise, or computer, or bon, and kira kira. The main unique aspect of katakana is that instead of writing the second vowel, you just write this horizontal line to show that the first vowel extends. So here, instead of writing the kana u or a in cruise or computer, you just write a horizontal line for all of them. Modern katakana also does have some uniquenesses to hiragana to cover more foreign pronunciations. For example, they sometimes add small vowel kana to other kana. If you remember, the only F-like sound they have in Japanese is fu, but sometimes they'll add a small vowel like e after it to make it fe, like when they're pronouncing Facebook. Same with a small e after te to make a t sound. For example, party. There are other unique sounds using the vowel kana combinations, and they even added tenten to the u kana to represent a V sound, but these use cases are quite rare, so I really wouldn't worry about it. It's just good to be aware they exist. Now, aside from the sound aspect of katakana, visually, some katakana look very similar to their hiragana counterparts, which help make them easier to learn. But in general, katakana have sharper edges than hiragana. So similarly to capital letters, katakana can be used for stylistic choices. But instead of a feeling of a loud sound like, oh my god, katakana makes words feel sharp, foreign, or visually punchy. For example, you'll often see robots or aliens in manga speak in katakana, or you'll see katakana used to emphasize certain words or exclamations. And that's it. Once you know the fundamentals of hiragana, katakana isn't too complicated. Which has us completing point 4. Use katakana. So now that we know katakana is used for foreign words, we'll understand why our sentence should actually use katakana for popcorn. Popcorn. It's a foreign word originating from outside of Japan. But to complete the characters of this sentence, there's one last writing system we need to go over. Kanji. Kanji are characters originating from Chinese and typically have one main meaning associated with them. Kanji are probably what most people think of when they think Japanese is hard to learn. And they are challenging for two main reasons. First, you need to be able to recognize 2100 kanji to be considered literate in Japan. That's a lot of symbols to recognize. But while it is a challenge, it's not as bad as you think. Kanji are intimidating at first because they look like random squiggles, but they are often built from the same recurring components, known as radicals. So as you learn more and more kanji, you start to recognize these radicals, and you start to see kanji as combinations of these building blocks. And the second legitimate challenge to kanji is that they often have at least two different readings. The Japanese reading, or kunyomi, and the Chinese reading, or onyomi. This arose because Japan didn't originally even have a writing system. They were just communicating verbally. But when kanji were introduced by Chinese influence around 500 AD, Japanese just attached those kanji to the spoken words that they already used. But they also kept record of the original Chinese reading for the characters as well, which is why there are typically those two readings. Today, if a kanji is by itself or combined with hiragana, it'll typically use the Japanese reading. If it's a combination of kanji, then those kanji will typically use the Chinese reading. Some of the basic kanji can be especially tricky because they sometimes have multiple different readings. But this is mostly just the case for some basic kanji. And ironically, as you learn more intermediate and advanced kanji, their readings become a lot more predictable, sometimes just having one reading. Okay, so maybe you'll understand that katakana is mostly used for foreign words, but when do you use hiragana versus kanji? Kanji are typically used in most nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. Nouns will typically be a single kanji or group of kanji, like house or worry, whereas verbs, adjectives, and adverbs will often be paired with hiragana, with conjugations being made by changing the hiragana. For example, changing eat into don't eat or eating, and so forth. This hiragana attached to kanji is known as okurigana. And sometimes there'll be small hiragana above the kanji to show you how to read it, known as furigana. This is often used if the resource is meant for children or learners, or if the kanji is particularly uncommon. Which gives us point 5, add kanji. And there we go. We now know why the word for I in Japanese, watashi, is written in kanji. It's a noun. And why the word for eat, taberu, is written in kanji and hiragana. It's a verb. And a little bonus, Japanese doesn't use spaces, so it would actually look like this. Using all three writing systems also helps distinguish between different words even without spaces. Whereas if it were all hiragana, it would be quite hard to read. Now that we've completed the fundamentals for the writing system and pronunciation, it's time to move on to grammar, which in my opinion is the most important element for beginning to understand Japanese and starting to build your own sentences. Let's first understand English. English uses subject-verb-object sentence order, or SVO. For example, I eat popcorn. The subject does something to the object. But Japanese uses subject-object-verb sentence order, or SOV, so the verb comes last, which would sound more like I popcorn eat. The subject has an object and does something to it. I remember this verb coming last thing used to always trip me up when I was learning Japanese. I'd be speaking, I'd accidentally say the verb, and oops, my sentence is over. It'll take some practice to get used to it, but just remember the verb always comes last. Which gives us point 6. Sentence order. Make sure the verb comes last. So our sentence, watashi taberu popcorn, should actually be ordered, watashi popcorn taberu, making it subject-object-verb. But in Japanese, as long as the verb comes at the end, sentence order isn't as strict as English. So we could even have the object come before the subject. Popcorn watashi taberu. Or literally, popcorn I eat. But there is a key grammar point that makes this word switching possible. And that is Japanese particles. Particles are grammatical markers in Japanese that show how words relate to each other in a sentence. Similar to English words like to, from, in, because, etc. They are almost always written in 1 to 2 hiragana, and they always go after the word they affect. For example, the particle wa marks the topic, so it goes after the topic. As an aside, it's written as the hiragana ha, but it's pronounced wa when it's the particle. This is one of those few cases where a hiragana is not read as it seems. In the sentence, I eat popcorn, I is the topic of the sentence, since we're talking about us eating the popcorn. So it's watashi wa. And the particle wo marks an object having an action done to it. In our case, the popcorn is being eaten, so we mark it with wo. Popcorn wo. So our sentence should really be watashi wa popcorn wo taberu, which is a truly grammatically correct sentence. But going back to sentence order, in English, sentence order is not as flexible. If instead of saying I eat popcorn, we say popcorn eats me, it's a totally different meaning. But in Japanese, since we clearly mark with particles how the words interact with each other, even if we switch the order to popcorn wo watashi wa taberu, it still makes perfect sense. Because for example, we know the popcorn is still the one being eaten since it's marked with the particle wo. Although as a side note, the subject coming first in the sentence is the most natural and common. Switching the order gives a feeling of emphasis, like the popcorn I will eat. So learning these particles and their purposes is key to understanding how to build your own sentences. So you could probably guess point number 7 is use particles. So we should add wa to mark us as the topic and wo to mark popcorn as the object. Watashi wa popcorn wo taberu. But even though our sentence is entirely grammatically correct and probably how a textbook would teach you how to say it, that's exactly the problem. It's how a textbook would say it. It's not actually how most Japanese people would say it. To sound even more natural in Japanese, you need to understand omissions. Japanese tends to omit any obvious information in a sentence, and this tends to be the subject. For example, the sentence, will you go? In Japanese, a full sentence would be, anata wa ikimasu ka? Or literally, you go? But in this case, the you is obvious from context, because I'm speaking to you. That's why the most natural Japanese is simply ikimasu ka? Or literally, go? Even in English, we occasionally do this too. Like instead of saying, do you want some? We often just say, want some? Or instead of saying, it looks good, we say, looks good, where the subject is being omitted. But Japanese just does it more often, and it's considered grammatically correct. A common trap learners fall into is always saying watashi wa or anata wa in their sentences, but most of the time, it's just left out. So going back to our sentence of watashi wa popcorn wo taberu, a more natural way to say it is simply popcorn wo taberu. Japanese even omits particles in casual speech if it's obvious as well. So the wo here is actually optional in casual speech because it's obvious the popcorn is the one being eaten. So we could say popcorn taberu, and it still sounds 100% natural. So point number 8 is practice omissions. Omissions take a bit of mental adjusting in the beginning because it can feel like something's missing. But once you're used to it, it can make Japanese a very fun and low effort language to speak.
なんか食べます？
じゃあお水いただきます。
おう、お前食べる？食うかヤギか俺。
But another mental adjustment you need to make is the way you express yourself can often be different. A lot of it comes from the cultural difference of being less direct. In the West, we'd often say, sorry, I can't do that. But in Japan, it'll often be, すみません、それはちょっと. Or literally, sorry, that's a little... And they don't even say the second part. They just imply it. Similarly, I can't afford that is sometimes 買う余裕がない. Or literally, I don't have the leeway to buy that. This is why you can't always expect a perfect Japanese equivalent for every English word. If you look up the word afford in a Japanese English dictionary, you'll get weird answers because there isn't an exact Japanese equivalent. So not only will you need to learn Japanese words, but you'll need to slowly pick up on the Japanese way of thinking and expressing yourself, which will come over time with enough exposure. These indirect ways of expressing yourself often come from the Japanese culture of equating indirectness to politeness. As you may know, Japan has a huge culture around showing respect, especially towards strangers, elders, and superiors. So you might not be surprised that you also express politeness by conjugating your verbs differently. You can think of there being 3 levels: casual, polite, and honorific. And this is a rough guide of when you'd use each of them. For example, the verb to eat will have different conjugations depending on the level of politeness, which, by the way, is why you often say itadakimasu before eating in Japan. You're essentially saying, I will humbly eat this food you've given me. But in general, you don't really need to worry about honorifics until advanced levels, because you just won't use them that often. So for the most part, you'll just want to know how to use the casual and polite form. For to eat, it's 食べる and 食べます. So going back to our sentence, ポップコーンを食べる. This is a correct casual way of saying it. But if we wanted to be polite, we would say ポップコーンを食べます. So just be aware that there are casual and polite ways to say things. But there's one final key about this sentence to make it sound absolutely polished as if a native speaker were saying it, and how to sound natural in general when you speak and minimize your foreign accent. And that key is pitch accent. We learned that in English, we often stress a syllable by making it longer and louder. Photography. But in Japanese, every kana is one mora, so no elongations. 食べる. But they do sometimes change the pitch on certain kana in words. There are essentially 4 pitch patterns: high pitch in the beginning, high pitch in the middle, high pitch at the end, or essentially flat throughout. For example, in our sentence, we say the word 食べる. But can you hear where the pitch is? 食べる. It's on the be in the middle. 食べる. 食べる. Compare this to if we were at the start, 食べる, or at the end, 食べる, or even just flat throughout, 食べる. So whereas English typically makes syllables longer and louder, photography. Japanese keeps the same length and volume, but can sometimes raise the pitch. 食べる. ポップコーン. But I really wouldn't stress too much about pitch accent in the beginning, because just like in English, it isn't absolutely necessary to comprehension. If someone said, let's get our cameras and do some photography, you know exactly what they're saying. Similarly, if you say ポップコーンを食べる instead of 食べる, people will have no problem understanding you. The correct pitch accent just helps make your speech sound more natural. And you will pick up a lot of the correct pitch accents naturally as you hear people speak. But I think just being aware this exists will help you keep an ear for it. And this gives us point number 10. Listen for pitch accent. So our final, fully natural sentence is ポップコーンを食べる. Congratulations! We've gone over all 10 points on how to turn this English sentence into a natural Japanese one. But before I send you off on your journey to learning Japanese and becoming the next Tom Cruise in Japan, there's actually one last fundamental you need to know about. And that is how Japanese proficiency is tested. The Japanese Language Proficiency Test, or JLPT, is the most widely recognized certification of Japanese ability. There are test sites in major cities around the world, but it's only hosted twice a year, the first Sunday in July and the first Sunday in December. and some locations only host it one of those days. There are 5 levels you can take, starting from N5, beginner, all the way up to N1, advanced comprehension. You don't need to take every level of the JLPT. You can jump levels and take whichever test you feel like. N3 is where you'll roughly start to become conversational, with N2 and N1 being where you'll typically become more fluent. N2 and N1 is also generally required by employers in Japan if you want to work here. This is a rough guideline of the total vocab, kanji, and grammar you'll need to know for each level. The lower levels have significantly less content, but they're also the most basic and commonly used. That's why even at N3, where you'll only know about a third of the content as N1, you can still be functionally conversational. And even if you don't plan on taking the tests, using the JLPT levels can be a great guideline for your studying. If you're just starting out, look for N5 level content. Then when you're done that, look for N4 level content, and so on. Now you know the fundamentals of the Japanese language and how it's officially tested. Congratulations! But if you want to know how to actually get started studying from nothing, watch my video here or stay tuned for an updated and more in-depth version here. Thanks for watching to the end and happy studying. Tokuyuu out.